Have you ever heard the expression hurt people hurt people? Well, in today's episode of the Seasons Stewardship Podcast, we're going to talk about 7 common effects of childhood trauma and how they affect us in our relationships. So hello, my name is Dr. Belinda-Rose Young, and I am a social scientist studying trauma and adverse childhood experiences and how they affect our relationships over time. So I'm so excited to be able to talk to you today about some common signs that there are out there and help you think about how to navigate them. So the first sign that I want to talk about is being really aggravated when people cut you off. So when someone is speaking with you and they cut you off during the conversation, it can make you feel as if you are small. It can make you feel as if they are not listening, they're not valuing your voice and what you have to say. Now, there's different things that can lead to this, but for those who have gone through different traumatic experiences where you said something and it was cut down, that's going to trigger responses in your adulthood. So some of these things could be, as a small child, adults in your life, whether parents or other caregivers, belittled you and you felt that in your body. And so now as an adult, when someone cuts you off, you still have that physical response. Another thing is when someone goes through a type of abuse and they say no, and someone doesn't listen to them, they still keep abusing them. Then that can make you feel, when you advocate for yourself as an adult and you say no or you try to say something, it can take you back to the time when you were a child. So this is something to be mindful of when you are in situations, especially as you're thinking about different cultures and how people converse, being more mindful that not everyone has malintentions towards you. That's something that I have had to be mindful of myself. For example, I come from a Caribbean household, and it's very common for two people to be speaking to each other at the same time. Now, because I understand the culture, it's not something that bothers me when someone is speaking with me at the same time. I've actually learned how to hear and talk at the same time. But if you are very hyper aware that someone is not letting you have the floor when you're speaking, it could be traced back to something that you experienced as a child. Number 2, clutter, or on the other end of the spectrum, obsessive cleaning. So let's start with clutter first. Clutter can manifest in a couple different ways, and it's not the same exactly as hoarding, but it's very similar. So when you're hoarding a lot of things, it can be because you have some sort of emotional attachment, maybe to the items itself, but it could also be because you have an emotional attachment to having things, right? And there's sort of a comfort that you have with having things around you. Whereas cluttering means that things are disorganized. So cluttering can be because your mind is not focused. You can go through periods of depression or different things where your mind itself is just scattered, if you will, maybe inability to concentrate so much. And that translates into your working environment, your living environment. So you might see this in the office space. You might see this at home. On the opposite end of the spectrum, as I said, is obsessive cleaning. And so when you're doing obsessive cleaning, it's because you want everything in alignment. You want to have that control over the environment, and you want everything in alignment. So think about both these things in the context of relationships. When you are living with someone who is either cluttering quite a bit or obsessively cleaning, it can have mal effects on the relationships themselves, right? So you have someone who is cluttering and you're annoyed because you keep tripping over things. That's leading to unnecessary arguments, right? Or maybe it's a situation where there's so much clutter that people can't find their stuff, or it's causing extra time and delay. If the other person isn't very sensitive to the fact that you've experienced different trauma, it can cause annoyance for them. On the other side, we are human beings. We're allowed to live and to have flexibility, especially in our home environments where we tend to feel more relaxed. And so when you have someone that's constantly cleaning behind you, that can disrupt that feeling of wanting to be settled in peace at home. Or if you have someone complaining about how you left the bowl in the sink as you're rushing to get to work, it can cause different aggravations and disturbances within a relationship, whether that's a familial relationship, a romantic relationship. It can manifest in a lot of different ways. A third effect or sign of childhood trauma is rejection. I don't hear people talk about this as much, but it is crucial to any type of relationship. So rejection can manifest in two ways, but they're very related. Rejection can be self-rejection. So this might look like me constantly putting myself down, maybe not able to accept any type of compliments at all, me apologizing all the time about different things. I'm just constantly putting myself down. If you think about, for those of you that are old enough to know this, if you think back to the Winnie the Pooh series and you think about Eeyore and just how he was weighed down and apologizing for things that he did not do. He apologized for the fact that it was raining outside. So that's a type of self-rejection. The other type of rejection is outward rejection. So it's me rejecting you. And usually this happens because the person is trying to preempt being rejected. So I'm going to distance you because I'm fearful that you might actually reject me. So when you have that in relationships, naturally that can come with a lot of conflict and issues, right? If someone is very concerned about being rejected by a child, a spouse, a coworker, then it's going to shut down conversation quite a bit. So maybe they did something wrong. Maybe an individual did something wrong. And instead of owning up to it, they're going to deny it because they don't want to be rejected. Or they're going to find someone else to blame because they don't want to be rejected. Rejection, outward rejection, is detrimental in relationships. Usually self-rejection, someone else that's not dealing with that might feel compassion towards that person and feel bad that they're feeling that way about themselves. But outward rejection can be hostile. Outward rejection can look like not taking responsibility for anything at all because they don't want to be rejected. So we have to understand that the root behind the rejection is fear. And it's fear of being pointed out, singled out for doing something wrong. Now, someone who has not gone through a lot of trauma, they can adjust, they can hear the word no, they can experience a level of rejection and be able to bounce back over time. Maybe you didn't get a job opportunity and you're really bummed because you wanted that job, but over time, like you recover, or maybe someone turned you down for another date and you were really kind of interested in getting to know that person more, but over time, like maybe a few weeks or so, you move on, right? Whereas someone who has a deep wound from trauma and a deep wound of rejection, it is hard. It is, for some people, just nearly impossible. They didn't get the job. They're not applying for any other jobs. They're going to stay in the job that they're in because at least I have it and I'm not going to be rejected anymore. So rejection, when you're dealing outward rejection, when you're in a relationship, whether it's a work relationship or a romantic relationship, whatever the case might be, you're going to see that they deny a lot of things. They are never at fault because there's a fear of being rejected. It's a fear of being exposed and someone pointing out the fact that they have done something wrong and thereby feeling rejected, right? Those that do a lot of outward rejection sometimes are really hard to love, but they're actually the people that need the most love. Before I go on to the fourth common effect of childhood trauma, I do want to make it clear that not because you've experienced trauma means that you will have all of these effects. You might experience one, you might experience something that's not on this list. But the 7 that I'm bringing to you today are common signs and effects of trauma. So number 4, arrested development. So when we talk about arrested development, what we mean is that there has not been the progression that there should be emotionally. So the person is very much growing up physically, but emotionally, they might act younger than their actual age. So you might see a 20-year-old, a 60-year-old acting as if they are a child. Now, there are some extremes where you might see like thumb sucking or things like that. But it could just be having a lot of tantrums. Like they just want their way all of the time. And they are just not willing to have it any other way, or emotional outbursts, or different things that you might associate with a younger age. It could be that they experienced really severe trauma at a particular age, and they just haven't been able to progress emotionally past that point. So naturally, that can cause a lot of issues in relationships. If you're looking at a romantic relationship and you're 50 and the other person's 50, but they act like they're 9, how do you progress in a relationship? How do you navigate that? How do you navigate the different controlling behavior that might come that's associated with a 4-year-old, that you would expect that to happen in a romantic relationship? And one of the things that I think is really important about this symptom, but also the other effects of childhood trauma, is that this happens in all types of relationships, as I've been saying. So you might be experiencing this in your home life, and what happens is that you start to experience secondary trauma based upon the trauma that the individual experienced and is expressing through these different symptoms. So now you're going to work, or you're going to class, or you're trying to function in other environments having experienced secondary trauma, and that can weigh quite a bit on you. So the fifth common effect of childhood trauma is overeating or undereating. So this can manifest in different ways. When you're overeating, it can be a source of comfort, a way to deal with new triggers that come up based upon the trauma that you experienced when you're younger. So let's say something negative has happened. Maybe someone's rejected you. Maybe you did poorly on a test. There is a level in which people sometimes cope using food, but it can be more extreme. It can definitely get to points where you are constantly eating to cope for any type of negative outcome. On the flip side, you can have undereating, where you are going through a level of self-punishment based upon things that you're facing right now, but it stems from what you experienced as a child. You wanted to punish yourself because you felt somewhat guilty for what happened. And so now your brain has wired itself to learn that, oh, I'm responsible for some of the bad things that happened to me, or maybe most of the bad things that happened to me. And so now that becomes your response to negative things that happen going forward. So the sixth effect of trauma is having a hard heart. This is where you have an inability to feel or have compassion towards those that are having a hard time. You see someone hurting and it's their fault. You don't really know the situation, but it's their fault. And part of this, similar to the overeating that I was talking about, is when you went through trauma as a child, you at some point decided it was your fault. We hear this commonly with divorce and with kids believing that the divorce was because of them. So as an adult, you still carry around that trauma, and when bad things happen to you or other people, you assume it's that person's fault. So you lose your ability to have compassion. Not only do you lose compassion towards others, but on the other side, you hurt others and you don't care. You don't care. That's where, again, the term hurt people comes into play, because somehow in your mind, whatever I did towards that person, they deserved it. They absolutely deserved it. The seventh common effect of trauma that's kind of been an undercurrent throughout the first six that I talked about, it is a physical response to triggers. So if you think back to when you were a child or even a teenager, there are likely songs that you enjoyed, you absolutely loved. And when you hear those songs as an adult, it takes you back. You start to reminisce about that concert, about that sleepover, about whatever that song was associated with. Also, food. Food has the ability to make us nostalgic. When grandma makes a sweet potato pudding or a casserole as an adult, it might remind you the time of when you were at grandma's house with your cousins playing in the backyard or at a special event during the holidays. So our body remembers. It remembers. And so as an adult, when different things come up, you can be triggered if you haven't fully dealt with the trauma. Studies have shown that your brain can be affected by trauma. And I want to make sure that this is very clear. This is not definitive, meaning it does not mean that because you've gone through trauma that your brain will be altered. There's many different things that you have to consider: the type of trauma, the severity of the trauma, the length of the trauma. For some people, it might have been a one-time event, and that was incredibly traumatic. For others, they might have had traumatic events every day for years. So there's a lot of different factors that can lead to your brain being affected by trauma, but it can be. It has the ability to, especially when you're younger and our brains are being developed, right? So when we're younger, we learn different responses to stimuli, to different events. As an adult, the same types of stimuli that happen can elicit responses. So maybe you were in a classroom and your teacher bullied you. They bullied you. And every time they were about to bully you, they made a scratch on the blackboard or they turned around in a huff. And your body remembers that because you were a kid, you had to sit there through it. And so as an adult, when someone turns around really quickly, your body can remember. Or if someone makes it like a noise that sounds a little bit jarring, your body can remember. So those are things that we want to be able to process in therapy and counseling and make sure that we're attuned, because the more we're aware of our triggers, the better we can preempt them and make sure that we are using different tactics to calm our bodies down and eventually not be affected by the trauma. Because here's the beautiful thing about the brain. Although you went through different trauma and your body learned to react a certain way, it can also learn to not react. So that takes time, that takes intentionality, that takes help and assistance with that, but it is possible. So those are 7 common effects of childhood trauma. And as I said before, the more we're aware of our behaviors, the more we're aware of our trigger points, the better prepared we are to start the healing process. And once we start healing, we can have better relationships and have healthier outcomes.